Hello, my name is Curtis Spivey, and we're going to be continuing our walk down Dixie Street today. As you see the credits here, I've used several references in Carroll County to give me perspective to this walk. I'll be using today tax records to give before pictures on some of the lots and present day pictures to show us how they exist today. As we stand at the railroad, we will be looking south. Now we're looking up the railroad to the west, to our right, at 501 West Dixie Street. A.A. Case Estate owned this property and in 1932 made a long-term lease to the Sinclair Refining Company. In 1939, Fountain Oil and Lube Fuel Depot. They built this structure here with the tanks to hold the supplies for their company, Mr. John W. and Lenora C. Fountain. It was this place that could be used to refill their trucks, or for farmers and businesses could come by and buy bulk oil and fuel to meet their everyday needs. On down at 505 West Dixie Street, Mr. Joe Veal had a service station. He was the owner, and his wife, Janice, was the manager. I remember a Mr. Wood who was the mechanic there. Sinclair products were sold, Goodyear tires, road service. They would even come and get your car and delivered if you'd just give them a call. Later, an antique shop and a junk store occupied this place. This building at East 520 Dixie Street was built in 1932. Wofford Oil Company. Their plant and their service station stood here. Later in 1964, Wood Service Station, and then later on, it was Warren's Coin-Operated Laundry, and it's also been the location of a catering service, a furniture store, and Ezra Kessler's barber shop. Yes, he was the one-handed barber that even cut my hair. Back at 523 West was a large house that was occupied by Miss Ruby McClendon. She taught at the city schools and later was the guidance counselor at Central School in the county. This large two-story house stood here with a grand entrance and a staircase. Yes, Aunt Ruby often even took in boarders. Home of the Carroll EMC. In 1936, a growing Carroll County was in much need of rural electrification. They originally built a plant on Rome Street just behind the City Hall. But Judge Tysinger, a famous lawyer in our county, along with 500 other farmers and local businessmen, proposed an electrical co-op. With a REA loan, they strung 112 miles of wire. And this even helped Southwire, a great company in Carrollton, get off the ground. In July, when the switch was thrown, more than 300 locals got their jolt into the modern age. The EMC occupied this building for years, and after an addition to the south, it was made there to have a meeting room and a demonstration room because there was a new invention like the microwave that needed to be showed off. The co-op would grow and eventually would move to a new facility on Temple Road on Highway 113. Today, this building is a modern facility for medical, still meeting the needs of Carroll County. A house was built here in 1907. Nora Farmer owned this property, and as I recall it, it was a rental house. And in its grand day, it took in many renters and stood as a grand house. The last occupants that I recall being there was the Britt family. Suddenly one night in the 1970s, the house burned to the ground. Now, a sleep clinic occupies the space, but it's all for sale if you have a buyer. There's no photo for this 1949 building. The property was owned by Dolly Robinson, and no tax records are found with a photo. But there was a house that stood at 528 East Dixie Street. Back to 601 West, a fine frame home was built by Robert Wood. This house was built in 1909 and even today stands in great shape, housing a medical facility. Back at East 602, this house was built in 1947. A small brick home was built here by Ira Newby. To my recollection, the house has always been a rental unit, sometimes a residence and sometimes even a beauty shop, but it's always been a busy place. At 604, next door to that, a 1949 model was erected. Often in rental units, the tax records show no new picture, only this picture is available. The owner was said to have been Lloyd Baxter, a fellow that I went to school with at Central. Built in 1939 by Newton J. White, this residence at 605 West was the home of Mr. White. He was a lifelong Carrollton resident and was partnered with Mr. Grady Nix in the Nix and White gas station and general merchandise on down Dixie Street. We'll see that place later. The home that once stood here was built in 1931. Records show that Miss Evelyn Campbell, she was the owner of this house, and nothing is left today except the memory in the grass. Back west at 609 Dixie Street, there's no original photo of the house that stood here, but I do remember that there being a small brick house. The original owners of this house were in 1897, and I do recall the small brick house that was built there in 1929, and the tax records show that a Mr. J.W. Jackson was the owner. East 612, built in 1949 by Walter L. and Miss Callie Burnham. The large white house that stood here had nothing much more to offer than a place for the Burnhams to live, and then a bedroom in the back that was offered to renters, and they also had privileges to the kitchen. In 1929, in 1929, Fred and Ruth Levins built this house, this two-story home. They were the owner of the Levins Oil Company, and today this building serves again as a medical facility. Back to 619 West. This 1958 building was built by Dr. Thomas E. Reeve, who later took on a partner, Dr. T.M. Martin, and they were to be Carrollton's first board-certified surgeons. Fine doctors. They've even worked on me. Around 1949, a large frame home occupied a portion of this lot. Believed to have been owned by the Burnham family, no clear records exist. Around 1968, though, to the best of my recollection and to the best of my memory, pharmacist John Robinson tore down the house and built Robinson Drug Company. I do recall a fine terrazzo floor being poured at night for the building. The floor contained brass dividing rails, which were eventually polished down to a marble-like finish. All is gone now. Tanner Medical is on the way. In 1959, the West Georgia Medical Group, headed by Dr. Elwyn Valentine Patrick, built a facility here. The contractor was Paul Williams. He lived next door to me down on 27 on Rooteville Road. Yep, he was the contractor. Doctors Bass, Talley, Burge, and Patrick all occupied this space at one time or another. And to the best of my recollection, Dr. Patrick was our first certified heart specialist, and this building also would house the first privately owned X-ray machine in Carrollton. In 1949, marks the beginning of an empire for the John Robinson Drug Company. After World War II, and becoming America's #1 fighter pilot instructor, John Robinson returned to Carrollton, married, and built this building. Yes, he built this structure, and later, after having a drugstore here for many years, he moved across the street. He continued in business until just before his death. Yep, just across the street. And today this business is known as Haney Drug Company, occupied by druggist Tim Oliver. Today, as on many of the remaining lots on this side of the street, we're on East 702. This block is owned by the Tanner Medical Center, and it's making its way for Tanner's new growth. In earlier times, a large brick building stood on this spot, and yes, Lane Truck and Tractor Company was here. They sold Farmall and International tractors, International trucks, and parts. Later, the building became the U.S. Army and Reserve Training Center. In the 1970s, Thomason Printing was located here, and later, Tanner Family Medical Center used this as an office space. Today, only memories remain, but soon, a new medical facility will be on board. At 702 East, gone but not forgotten, Dr. Phil C. Aston Jr. practiced medicine here on this very spot. His neatly kept brick building welcomed customers for many decades. At East 706 Dixie, built in 1950 by Paul Williams, my neighbor, this building housed a variety of tenants: Anderson Florist, Bentley Beauty Shop, and the dentist, Dr. William Trinkner, William Brock, Irvin DeGarris, and a physician, Francis Parks. Last but not least, and finally, the occupant of this was the Tanner Hospice Care. The full city block is home to Tanner Medical Center. Mr. C.M. Tanner in 1943 pledged a whopping $75,000 towards building a $100,000 hospital. The citizens soon raised the rest, the other $25,000, and with the start of World War II, supplies were short, so construction would have to wait until later. The Hill-Burton Act, though, was passed in 1946, and it supplied funds interest-free to hospitals with indigent care service. Tanner was the first Hill-Burton hospital to be built in the United States. The facility was built by contractor, again, Paul Williams, and opened in October of 1949. After 1950, the Carroll County Health Center, a miniature of the original hospital, was open. Near a mean old Mrs. Bessie Rowe was the head nurse there, and she gave all us kids polio shots when we were getting ready for school. But thanks, Miss Rowe, you saved us lots of trouble. In the late 1920s, Mr. Fred Levins opened and operated Levins Incorporated, an oil and gas distribution facility on this spot at East 718 Dixie Street. This location was known as Levin's Flat, which was also home to several dilapidated houses and eventually a taxi service. You know, most taxi services in Carrollton were kept alive not only by a few patrons riding the taxi, but by the drivers delivering moonshine whiskey to all the locals. Dr. L.W. Brown's Eye Shop. This nicely appointed structure has graced the corner of Dixie Street and Clinic Avenue for many years. As you can see, though, a large frame house once occupied this corner. There are no records that show anybody who owned this property except that Burson came here early on. Back across at East 806 Dixie, Dr. Tillman, an optometrist, now stands on the south end of what was known as Levin's Flat. The records for many of Dixie Street properties have, over the years, mysteriously disappeared, and they're only replaced by a single file card showing who owns the property today. The McIntosh Bank was built on the one-time home of Shirey's Motel. Sometimes referred to as the 650 Motel, That was assuming that this was the amount for a night's stay. In the 1950s, Opal and Ruby Shirey built this motel as a part of their home. It was added on to several times and went under a good many renovations before it was finally closed, and it succumbed to the progress of the banks, Southwire, and the hospital. According to Miss Bama Carroll, a large home that stood here was built in 1887. For some reason, my mother always referred to it as the clinic. And in the 60s, I remember it had multiple doors on the back that opened out to the outside, and it looked more like a motel to me. But Mr. Reuben Carroll, who was a friend of my father, lived here, and in the 60s, he had many cages filled with white rabbits. Somehow or another, he convinced my daddy that we'd do well in the bunny business. So off to our house came the cages, rabbits and all. I did make a good bit of money at Easter selling little bunnies, and my mother would sometimes get a call for dressed rabbits, which seemed strange to me because every time they left our property, they were undressed. The Barker house stood here, always crisp and always white, kept in great shape. Just like the house, the records are gone and we know nothing else about it. At West 819, for the next few lots, the records are sort of mixed up, but I do recall in this area that Dr. Rudy had his office at this location sometime in the 1970s. Harvey Bell and Hari Stallings also lived here in a house back in the early 1960s. At West 825 Dixie, Dr. William B. Moore's dentist office was here from the mid-50s until he retired, and he was also my first dentist. And I do recall that he said what he was about to do to me wouldn't need a shot. But you can bet money I'd rather been shot than to have him pull my tooth the way he did. At 831, built in 1939 by Olin Foles, this fine brick house was eventually owned by Betty Smith Morgan of Morgan Oil, and then eventually by Dennis William Moore and James Prather. The house still stands today and is in fine shape. On this corner, there was a small house that was built in 1947, and it seems it was a part of the Shirey Motel property. If you'll look closely in the back, you can see the silos of Hollingsworth Concrete. That's on Fertilla Street, way back in the back, across the railroad, East 832 Dixie. Carl Walker built this house in 1946. In 1951, Milton J. Martin, brother to Ms. Walker, bought the house from him. He bought it for himself, Hazel, and their daughter, Kay, to live in for several years. A part of the Southwire corner, this lot is just a park now. Southwire seemed to be nothing but just a shotgun building back when it first started, right there in the left corner. It was just a small plant. But as you can see, this building looked over Southwire, and there was two people who occupied this building. It was Mr. Alta Smith and Mr. Mac Wethington. It was known as Smith and Wethington Grocery. Later on, Smith sold to Wethington, and it became Wethington's Grocery, Mac Wethington. In my later years, it was just T.M. Wethington Grocery. It had 2 gas pumps and a variety of groceries, watches, and toys. A trip to Mac's was always fun for me. In 1936, Carl and Edna Walker built a fine brick home here. The same year, they also constructed a house in the back for the yard man to live in. After their death, the estate sold the property to Tanner Medical Center, and it was all torn away. In 1946, a 1946 model owned first by Hugh L. Stevens. Then, later, timber baron and tycoon Hester Bennett bought this house. I do recall it being an apartment on the right and Hester Bennett's office on the left. All had to go, though, for the growth of Southwire. Gone but not forgotten. After being built in 1887, tax records show that this building was owned by Lewis L. Smith and John Jones. Eventually, it was sold to Tim McGugan. The house today is his surveying office and once stood as his wife's interior decorating studio. No records are showed for this photo except that Mr. William H. Horsley at one time owned this property, again making way for Southwire. Back to East 922. Nothing remains today except the recollection of Mitchell Egg Pitts, whose family lived here. Pitts ran the Dixie Street bait shop on down the street, and his name, Egg, came from the fact that when he was a youngster, he would go around the square with a basket full of eggs. All of this was to conceal a bottle of whiskey. When this whiskey was sold, Pitts returned back home for a refill. He never sold an egg, but made many a man happy with his spirits. Mitchell finally retired to Highway 27 South, where he still was the vendor of fine spirits, if you know what I mean. East 1004 Dixie Street. The Tasty Grill was owned by Hoyt Pitts, Egg Pitts' brother. I recall a wooden building that stood at this location in the 50s and 60s, and a Mr. Campbell, who was Pitts' father-in-law, lived in a nice little frame house in the back. Around 1964, the building burned to the ground and was replaced by a masonry structure. They had the best hamburgers in town, but with Hoyt Pitts' health waning, he moved to South Street and the building became the Carrollton Soup Kitchen. Now, though, it's torn away and part of the Southwire empire. East 1014 Dixie, site of the Hoyt Pitts home, who was the owner of the Tasty Grill. Yep, another gone but not forgotten. East 1018 Dixie Street was the Dixie Street Bait Shop, owned by Mitchell Egg Pitts. There was a small frame house here that had been converted to a bait shop. Yep, bait for the fish and spirits for the angler. At 1021 Dixie Street, right in the corner of Old Roop Street in Dixie, this building was built in 1947. Fred Shirey was the owner. The building was called the Dixie Street Curb Market, and it was at the corner of the two streets. They sold groceries, beer, fishing equipment, and pretty much whatever you'd need for an afternoon of fun. Even in the south end, a later building was added that housed a TV repair shop. East 1022 Dixie Street stood the Dixie Street Motel, owned by Seaman Baskin. The horseshoe-shaped building was available from many sides, and salesmen that came to the Carrollton area would often stay here. You know, Highway 27 South was the route from up north to Florida, and it made it a good stopping place for vacationers. You can see my brother standing here, Richard Spivey. He's standing in the front office door, which faced south. 1922, built by Grady W. Nix. He was the owner of Nix and White Grocery, but he built this house here and lived there with his wife until they both passed away. West 1030 Dixie Street. In 1954, Grady Nix and Mr. White built a fine little store here. To the best of my recollection, Mr. Nix was the operator, but you could get a few fishing worms and oil for your car, and it was a 2-pump station out front. Back to East 1034 Dixie Street, now the entrance to Southwire. A necessary part of Carrollton once stood here. Shirey and Company, General Merchandise. They was here. Yes, it was owned by Opal Shirey. Not only a dry goods store, but a gas station, a grist mill, and later R.L. Perry bought the property and opened up the Red Dot, which eventually became the Food Town store you see here. And Newt Muse Electric Company in the early 60s was in what was once the grist mill down on the south side. My father and I both worked here in the 60s. I started bagging groceries for a whopping 65 cents an hour, plus tips. 1035, Ms. John Fountain built this service station in 1949. I do recall that it was once occupied by Mr. Bailey, who not only serviced cars and sold gas, but he bought used automobile batteries and rebuilt them to be resold. At 1039 Dixie Street, 1035 Dixie Street, you can see the Sinclair station here, which has been torn away. 1039 Dixie. No date for this building, but I do know that in 1947 and 48, my grandfather, C.W. Chatham, worked for Archer Construction Company that was located here. They built the houses on Carroll Street. Later, there was a West Lincoln and Mercury dealership, and in the 60s, much to my Fanny's dismay, it was a roller skating rink. Later and last, Winnelson Plumbing Supply was located here. Now it's Southwire Park. Southwire entrance was once home to Larry Rivas. He was a grocery clerk at Perry's Red Dot. A small frame house stood here for many years and was home to several people. Now if we'll walk on down Dixie Street to where it runs into the bypass, we can look southeast across Southwire's Employment Center, and we can see still the hill outlined in the distance. This picture shows the Highway 27 bypass under construction. You can see that much has changed on Dixie Street through our years, from our very first walk at Noonan Street to our last walk down here at the bypass. But just remember, history is slipping away from us, so I ask that you take your photos and you take your stories. You write your stories down and you write on your photos who, what, when, and where. And remember to share these with your family and friends, because when us old folks are gone, there'll be no more. I'd like to thank you for joining me on this walk down Dixie Street, and it pleases me much to be able to share this with you. Good day.